In the world of death row records, loyalty could make you a legend and get you killed. Heron Palmer wasn't just another name in the crew. He was the man they called when things got real. A feared Mob Piru enforcer with a body count whispered to be 17. Tupac's protector. A fixer when death row's chaos threatened to boil over. And if the streets are telling the truth, the man who caught the eye, and maybe the heart, of Lisa Left Eye Lopez. Heron's story is stitched into the most dangerous chapter of West Coast rap history. Join us as we take a deep dive into this story filled with twists and turns. This isn't just about the music, it's about the streets, the politics, and the power moves that came with living and dying by the code. Heron Palmer wasn't just another face in Compton. He was Mob Piru through and through. Mob Piru, also called Mob Piru, Eastside Mob Piru, Insane Mob Gang, wasn't some small-time crew. They were one of the most feared blood sets out there. And this set didn't come from nowhere. They were part of the Bigger Bloods Alliance, a network born from beef, street politics, and years of fighting for control. To understand Heron, you gotta understand where Mob Piru came from. Back in 1969, there was a crew called the Piru Street Boys. Sylvester Scott and Vincent Owens started it. At first, some say they were cool with the Crips. Others swear that's a lie, that the Crips were never friends, only predators. Either way, by '72, the Piru Street Boys linked up with other small gangs that had their own problems with the Crips. Crews like the Brims, Bishops, and Denver Lanes. They formed an alliance, and they called themselves the Bloods. From then on, blood wasn't just a word, it was a badge. Over time, new blood sets popped up. One of them was Mob Piru. According to Reggie Wright Jr., they weren't always separate from Looters Park Piru. They used to be one gang before splitting. But even after the split, Mob Pirus stayed locked in with Looters Park, their territory just across Rosecrans Avenue. Together, they kept their side of Compton locked down. The east side of Compton, where the Mob Pirus were based, was mostly black. Their turf sat in the northeast, right next to Linwood. This was home turf for real street legends. The most famous, Marion Suge Knight. Before the world knew him as Death Row's boss, Knight was a football player. He had a shot in college at UNLV, even played in the NFL during the '87 strike season as a scab player. But the league didn't last for him, and when that door closed, another opened. He started doing bodyguard work, and little by little, he stepped deeper into the world of Mob Piru. By the early '90s, Suge wasn't just repping Mob Piru, he was making moves for them on a whole new level. He co-founded Death Row Records with Dr. Dre, using seed money from Michael Harry O'Harris. That label blew up fast, putting out Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, Corrupt, Mishal Ali, and of course, Tupac Shakur. Death Row became the top rap label in the country, dominating the '90s. But this wasn't just about music. Suge brought the streets into the boardroom. The same way he stacked platinum records, he stacked soldiers around him, Mob Piru soldiers. This is where Heron's world collided with the music industry. Death Row was more than a label. It was a power move, a way for the MOB to flex on a global stage. But it came with street rules. That meant old beefs didn't disappear just because you were on TV. Mob Piru's name came up heavy in one of the most infamous chains of events in hip-hop history. Trayvon Trey Lane, another MOB member, got into it with Southside Compton Crip Orlando Baby Lane Anderson. It was April 1996 at a Foot Locker in Lakewood Mall. Word is, Anderson and his boys took a Death Row chain right off Lane's neck. In gang culture, that's more than theft. It's a public slap in the face. Months later, on September 7th, Lane spotted Anderson at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. He pointed him out to Tupac, saying, "That's the fool who snatched my chain." Tupac didn't waste time. He swung on Anderson. The crew jumped in. The whole thing was caught on hotel security cameras. Death Row was never the same after that night. The momentum died, the empire started cracking, and the street ties that once made them powerful started pulling them under. Mob Piru wasn't just in the music game for show. They were deep in criminal work. Drug runs, gun sales, robberies, business as usual. Suge himself was accused of supplying the MOB with heavy artillery, assault rifles, and more. The label's shine couldn't hide the fact that they were knee-deep in gang wars. By the mid-90s, Death Row was the #1 rap label, but the streets still owned them. Suge Knight played the part of the untouchable boss. Gold chains, diamond rings, front row at award shows. He had celebrities around him and corporate America cutting checks. But no matter how high he climbed, he stayed tied to the MOB, and those ties came with enemies. In the streets, power makes you a target. You see, Death Row Records wasn't built like other labels. This wasn't just a place where artists came to record hits. It was a fortress, a street operation wearing a music industry mask. Founded in 1991 by the Doe C, Dr. Dre, Suge Knight, Dick Griffey, and Michael Harry O'Harris, the label came out swinging. West Coast hip-hop was already making noise, but Death Row made sure everyone in the game felt the earthquake. Dr. Dre dropped The Chronic, Snoop came with Doggy Style and The Dogfather, then Tupac delivered All Eyes on Me and The Don Killuminati, The 7 Day Theory. The label wasn't just hot, it was unstoppable. At its peak, Death Row was pulling in over $100 million a year, but the shine came with shadows. The more the label grew, the deeper it sank into street politics. Suge Knight, the man running the empire, wasn't just signing artists, he was putting his own set on the payroll. Suge had ties to the Mob Piru Bloods, and he brought many of them straight into Death Row. Wardell Poochie Faust, Big Jake Robles, Trayvon Tree Lane, Alton Buntry McDonald, Henry Hendog Smith, and of course Aaron Heron Palmer. These weren't just homies hanging out, they were enforcers, protectors, and sometimes the ones carrying out payback when a line got crossed. By the mid-90s, the streets and the studio were completely intertwined. When Tupac joined Death Row in 1995, he didn't just sign a record deal, he stepped into the Mob Piru's world. That meant more than music videos and tours. It meant being tied to the Bloods, with all the baggage and danger that came with it. After Tupac's death, Dr. Dre had already bounced, and Snoop Dogg would be gone soon after. Suge's legal problems mounted, and the label's reputation, once a mix of fear and respect, started tipping toward chaos. Mob Piru members tied to Death Row began dropping one by one. Poochie Faust was murdered in 2003. Buntry McDonald was gunned down in 2002. Hendog Smith was killed in 2002. But even as bodies fell, the label kept pushing music. The problem was the violence never stopped. Death Row had become the perfect storm of fame, money, and gang warfare. The same connections that made it powerful were tearing it apart from the inside. Inside the label, Suge was a towering figure, literally and figuratively, over 6 feet tall, more than 260 pounds, with the kind of presence that made people move out of his way without him saying a word. When someone asked him once how it felt to be feared, Suge replied, "I don't look at it as fear, I look at it as respect." But in the streets, that line was thin. Some respected him, some feared him, and plenty wanted him gone. Suge wasn't a typical industry boss. He came from Compton, raised in the kind of neighborhood where you learned early how to fight and how to survive. Football was his way out, first at UNLV, then briefly in the NFL with the Los Angeles Rams during the 1987 players' strike. But when the NFL door closed, he found another hustle. He started working as a bodyguard for R&B and hip-hop stars. And in the music industry, he spotted the same thing he saw in the streets. Power was everything. That mindset led to some of Death Row's most famous moments. The story about Vanilla Ice still gets told, how Suge allegedly leaned on him to give credit and royalties to songwriter Mario Chocolate Johnson. Vanilla Ice denies being hung over a balcony, but the tale became part of Suge's legend. He wasn't afraid to step in, settle a score, and make sure his people got paid. That edge was exactly what Dr. Dre needed in 1991 when he wanted out of Ruthless Records. Dre was stuck under Eazy-E and Jerry Heller, feeling cheated. Suge and his crew allegedly rolled into Ruthless's offices with baseball bats and heavy threats. Eazy-E was eventually convinced, some say forced, to sign Dre's release papers. That's when Death Row was born, with $1.5 million in seed money from Harry O., a drug kingpin doing time. From there, the label moved like a street army. The launch party in Beverly Hills was a mix of industry heavyweights and gang figures, two worlds that weren't supposed to mix, but under Suge, they did. Dre's The Chronic dropped in '92, introducing the world to Snoop Dogg and bringing G-Funk to the mainstream. Doggy Style followed, going multi-platinum. When Tupac came on board, Death Row had the streets and the charts locked down. But behind the platinum plaques and award shows, the danger was real. Fights, shootings, and intimidation weren't just rumors. They were part of the daily operation. "This is more than just music," one insider said. "This is dangerous," and it was. In '96, the Orlando Anderson situation proved that Death Row's business wasn't just on the mic. After Tupac's murder, the label started bleeding from the inside. Dr. Dre left just before Pac died. Snoop was out 2 years later. Lawsuits piled up. Suge kept catching cases, assault charges, parole violations, and eventually a 2015 hit and run that left one man dead. By the late 90s, Death Row wasn't the empire it once was. By 2006, the walls had closed in completely. Suge filed for bankruptcy after losing a lawsuit to Lydia Harris, who claimed she was cheated out of half the label. Court documents painted a picture of a man who went from millions to almost nothing. Just $11 in his bank account, $1,000 worth of clothes, $2,000 in furniture and $25,000 in jewelry. He put his Malibu mansion up for sale and watched it get sold in bankruptcy court. In 2009, Death Row's assets were auctioned off to Wide Awake Entertainment for $18 million. That company went bankrupt in 2012, and the label was sold to Entertainment One, later owned by Hasbro. Yes, the toy company. In 2022, Snoop Dogg bought Death Row back, talking about reviving it. But no matter who owns it now, the story of Death Row is forever tied to the gang ties that built it and the bodies that fell along the way. And in that list, Heron Palmer's name stands out. He wasn't just another Mob Piru member on the payroll. He was Suge's muscle, Pac's protector, and a man with a reputation so feared, the streets still talk about it today. Lisa Left Eye Lopez was already a star before she ever set foot inside Death Row Records. As 1/3 of TLC, she had the fame, the money, and the hits. But by 2001, things were different. Her solo album Supernova had dropped under Arista, and it didn't move the way she hoped. Behind the scenes, there was tension, real tension, with her group mates, Chili and T-Boz. On top of that, she was having her own problems with Steve Stout, a powerful producer and manager connected to her label. Frustrated and looking for a way out, she picked up the phone one day while staying at a hotel in Santa Monica or Beverly Hills. She called the Death Row office directly. She wanted to talk to Suge Knight himself. The request was bold, but that was Left Eye. She didn't wait around for things to happen. She made them happen, and this time, she wanted Suge's help to break free from her deal. It didn't take long for that call to turn into something more. Soon, she was hanging around Death Row almost every day. She started spending time with Suge, and the connection between them got personal, fast. Before long, she moved into a place on Wilshire Boulevard. The spot wasn't even meant for her originally, but she stayed there for 3 to 4 months, and during that time, she became a part of the Row's daily rhythm. Their relationship wasn't calm, it was fire. People who were there described it as intense, passionate, and unpredictable. Left Eye was a firecracker, someone who wasn't afraid to speak her mind, even in a room full of tough men. She was aggressive when she wanted to be, but not in a reckless way, more like someone who knew her worth and refused to back down. She had her own unique way of living too. Left Eye was health conscious before it was cool. She ate clean, used natural products, and even cleaned with baking soda instead of harsh chemicals. But just because she was focused on health didn't mean she was all peace and calm. She could be confrontational. If something was on her mind, you were going to hear it, loud and clear. That side of her showed in one of the wildest moments people still talk about. One night, Suge didn't come home for a while. Maybe she was hurt, maybe she was angry, but whatever the reason, she acted. In the penthouse built on top of the Death Row office, she tried to set fire to a bed. Security got to it before the flames could spread, but it was a close call. Whether she only meant to torch the bed or more of the place, no one really knows, but it was a clear sign. When she felt crossed, she reacted. Over time, the relationship between her and Suge turned more unstable. The same passion that pulled them together also caused clashes. Things got too heated, too violent, too unpredictable. Eventually, she walked away. She left that chapter behind and went back to focusing on her own life and career. Not long after, she took a trip that would later connect to the tragic car accident in 2002 that ended her life. Through it all, Left Eye kept a certain respect for the people she was close to. She was always respectful to the storyteller who shared these memories, but she didn't let anyone, not even Suge Knight, control her. Suge was known to like strong, bold women who could stand up to him, and Left Eye fit that perfectly. She was independent, fierce, and completely unafraid of the men around her. And while her time around Suge was well known, there were whispers in the streets about something else, something that never made headlines the same way. People say she and Heron Palmer had a thing, that there was a deeper connection between them than most realize. Nothing was ever proven, but in the world of Death Row, rumors had a way of carrying their own kind of truth. If it was real, it would have been one of the most unexpected links in the whole Death Row story. A superstar R&B icon and a feared Mob Piru enforcer with a reputation for 17 bodies. And if those whispers were true, it meant that Left Eye's story in the Row wasn't just about her music deal or her relationship with Suge. It meant she was tied, in her own way, to one of the most feared men in that building, and that makes her chapter in this story even more dangerous. Now, to understand just how deep that danger ran, you have to look past the music and straight into the life of the man himself, because Heron wasn't just feared, he was the kind of figure that made even gangsters watch their step. Aaron Verdale Palmer, better known on the streets as Heron, Goldie, or even Smokey Robinson's son, wasn't the type of man you met halfway. Born in 1962 and raised in Compton, he came up in a time when the city was already simmering with tension. The Bloods and Crips hadn't yet grown into the powerful organized forces they would later become, but the violence was real, and survival meant moving smart, moving fast, and knowing exactly who had your back. Heron learned those lessons early. From a young age, he was deep in the hustle. Armed robberies, drug dealing, gang violence. This wasn't a side hustle or something he stumbled into. It was his world. People knew his name long before they ever knew his face. They knew him as a man who didn't back down, no matter who was standing in front of him. He was tall, strong, and built like someone you wouldn't want to test. The streets said he had no fear in his blood, and they weren't wrong. By the late 80s and early 90s, Heron's path crossed with one of the most powerful men in the hip-hop game, Suge Knight. Death Row Records was on the rise, stacking platinum albums and making millions. But it wasn't just music driving the machine. It was muscle, it was street power, and Suge wanted Heron close. Officially, Heron was hired for security, but anyone who knew the Row understood what that really meant. He wasn't just a bodyguard, he was the guy you called when words weren't enough. Heron was the label's quiet storm. In an environment full of loud voices and big egos, he didn't have to shout to be heard. He was the type who could walk into a room and change the energy without saying a word. But when he did speak, people listened. They knew that behind his calm tone was a man who had handled problems permanently. His nickname, Mr. 17, came from his own claim that he had killed 17 people. Whether the exact number was true didn't matter. The streets believed it, and that was enough to make most men think twice before crossing him. Despite his violent reputation, Heron had a code. He was fiercely loyal to his people, and no one got more of that loyalty than Tupac Shakur. Pac was more than an artist under the Death Row banner. He was a friend. In the chaos of the mid-90s rap wars, when tensions between Bloods and Crips were boiling over, Heron was there to protect him. Whether it was stepping in during confrontations or making sure Pac's movements were secure, Heron had his back. The two shared moments off the stage too. Talks, laughs, the kind of bond you only get when trust is earned in dangerous places. But in Death Row, loyalty didn't always guarantee safety. By the mid-90s, the empire was starting to crack. Tupac's death in September 1996 hit Heron hard. The loss was personal, and in the streets, personal meant payback. Rumors swirled about Heron's role in the aftermath, about how far he was willing to go to even the score. People who knew him said, if Heron called you family, he'd ride for you until the wheels fell off. And if you crossed someone he cared about, you'd better be ready to pay for it. Inside Death Row, Heron was more than muscle. He was a fixer. When tempers flared between artists, producers, or even Suge himself, Heron could step in and cool the fire. There's a story from one late night in the studio. A night when some of the label's biggest names were in the building. A fight broke out in the lobby. It started with words, then came shoves, then fists. Chairs got tossed, voices rose, and the whole thing was seconds away from turning into an all-out brawl. Heron stayed in the corner, watching, not rushing in, not picking sides. When the moment was right, he walked into the middle of it and said, "We're all here to make music. The moment we forget, that is the moment this empire collapses." Those words hit different in that room. The fight stopped, people backed down, but Heron knew better than anyone that peace in Death Row was always temporary. The same fire that made them a powerhouse could burn it all to the ground at any time. Even as he kept the chaos in check, Heron was playing a dangerous game. Word around the label was that he wasn't getting paid what he was owed. For a man who risked his life daily, that wasn't just disrespect, it was a betrayal. And in the streets, betrayal is deadly. Tension built between him and other Death Row players, especially George Pooey Williams, another figure in Suge's circle. The bad blood between them kept growing, and eventually, it was past the point of no return. Heron's life was full of contradictions. He was feared, but he was trusted. He could be the calm in the storm or the storm itself. In the world of Death Row, where power struggles and shifting alliances could make or break a man, Heron played both sides of survival, handling business in the shadows, making sure things got done without always making headlines. And yet, his presence was impossible to ignore. People who saw him work remember how he carried himself, quiet but commanding, calculated but quick to act when it mattered. He was the man you wanted on your side when the room got hot, but also the man you didn't want to see walking towards you if you'd crossed a line. Even in Hollywood dramatizations, Heron's legend lives on. He was portrayed in Unsolved, 2018, reminding audiences that behind the music, the videos, and the platinum plaques, there were men like him, men whose stories were built on survival, violence, and loyalty. The talk about his connection with Lisa Left Eye Lopez, whether it was just friendship or something more, keeps adding mystery to a man whose life already reads like a cautionary tale from the heart of Compton. If the rumors are true, it means that while Heron was feared as Mr. 17, he also had a side that drew one of R&B's brightest stars into his orbit. But in the Row, nothing stayed untouched by danger. And for Heron Palmer, every chapter in his story was written in the ink of the streets, the kind of ink you can't erase, no matter how much time passes. When Tupac rapped, "Neckbone Trey, Heron, Buntry too, Big Rock got knocked, but this one's for you," He wasn't just throwing out random names. Those were his people, his inner circle. And right there, in the middle of that line is Aaron Heron Palmer. Pac wasn't shouting out studio buddies or casual acquaintances. He was calling out real ones, men who had stood beside him when things got heated, who were part of the machine that kept Death Row moving in the streets as much as it did in the music business. By the time Tupac came to Death Row in 1995, Heron was already in the building. He had been working under Suge Knight, handling security, and let's be real, handling whatever else needed to be handled. He wasn't some guy who put on a red rag for the cameras. Heron's reputation on the streets was solid, feared, respected, and tested. People who knew him didn't confuse him with the gangster image some artists like to wear in videos. Heron was the type of man who had already been living that life before the label money came in. When Pac and Heron met, they clicked instantly. They understood each other. Pac had his own street credibility, but he also had a different background: art schools, theater, and a message that reached beyond the block. Heron came straight from Compton's roughest corners with a past full of robberies, hustling, and heavy violence. On paper, they were different, but in reality, they shared something bigger: loyalty, ambition, and an unspoken understanding of the danger around them. Heron wasn't the type to judge someone based on race or background. People said he would do business with anyone: black, Latino, white, Asian. It didn't matter. What mattered to him was respect. You showed him respect, you got it back. You crossed him, you might not live long enough to cross him twice. That balance of open-mindedness and a hair-trigger sense of retaliation made him a man you wanted as a friend, not an enemy. Pac saw that in him. In the short time they knew each other, Pac learned Heron was a man who could be counted on when things went sideways. Death Row wasn't a safe space. The energy was always charged. Egos clashed. Old beefs resurfaced, and the line between music business and street business didn't exist. In that kind of environment, an artist like Tupac needed more than just bodyguards and suits. He needed soldiers. Heron was that. Their bond wasn't just about physical protection, though. Around Pac, Heron wasn't trying to play the part of a scary street legend. They laughed. They talked. They shared moments that weren't all about beef and business. But that didn't mean Heron ever let his guard down when it came to Pac's safety. If Pac was moving, Heron was aware of every face in the room, every car in the lot, every exit out the building. He wasn't flashy about it, he just did it. That's what made him dangerous in the best way for Pac. It says a lot that Pac immortalized him in a song. Being named in a track like To Live and Die in LA wasn't just about friendship, it was a public stamp of respect. It told the world, this man is part of my circle, part of my life. In the streets, that kind of recognition wasn't just about fame, it was about trust. But this was Death Row. In the mid-90s, Pac's presence had taken the label's energy to a whole new level. More music, more attention, more enemies. And while Heron was there to protect him from outside threats, no one could protect Pac from the storm brewing inside Death Row and within the East Coast-West Coast war. Still, until the end, Heron was one of the men who rode for Pac without hesitation. He wasn't a hype man. He wasn't there for the shine. He was there because that's what loyalty meant to him. In a world where everybody was playing a part, Heron was one of the few who actually lived it. And in Death Row's history, that made him unforgettable. But even the most loyal soldiers can't stop a storm once it's already coming. And for Heron, the night that would change everything was already unfolding, step by step. September the 7th, 1996 started out like a celebration. Mike Tyson had just walked into the ring and dropped Bruce Seldon in under 2 minutes. It was fight night in Las Vegas, and the MGM Grand was buzzing. Tyson walked out to a Tupac track, and Pac himself was sitting ringside with Suge Knight, the head of Death Row. The cameras caught them smiling, talking, enjoying the moment. But in the streets and in that building, old problems were waiting to explode. After the fight, Pac, Suge, and the Death Row entourage hit the MGM lobby. Among them was Trayvon Lane, a Mob Piru member and a Death Row affiliate. Trayvon spotted someone in the crowd, Orlando Baby Lane Anderson, a Southside Compton Crip. The bad blood between them had been boiling since months earlier, when Orlando and other Southside Crips allegedly jumped Trayvon at the Lakewood Mall and snatched his Death Row medallion. In gang terms, that wasn't just theft, it was humiliation. When Trayvon pointed Orlando out, Pac didn't hesitate. He walked straight over and swung. That's when the Death Row crew rushed in. Suge, Alton Buntry McDonald, Roger Neckbone Williams, and Aaron Heron Palmer. Heron, the quiet but feared Mob Piru enforcer, was right there in the mix. For him, this wasn't just about Pac. This was Mob Piru business. And in his world, if your homie had a score to settle, you were in it too. The beatdown was caught on MGM security cameras. Orlando ended up on the floor, surrounded. The fight only lasted seconds before security stepped in, but the damage was done. It wasn't just a brawl. It was a public attack on a known Southside Crip, and that meant war. The Death Row crew left the MGM before the cops could make any arrests, but everyone in that lobby knew what had just happened. The Crips weren't going to let it slide. Heron knew the rules. When you push that line, you'd better be ready for the pushback. Later that night, the plan was to head to Club 662, a death row-owned spot where Pac was supposed to perform. Suge was behind the wheel of a black BMW, with Pac in the passenger seat. The rest of the death row convoy, including security and Thay outlaws, followed behind. Somewhere in that rolling group of cars was Heron. Driving down East Flamingo, things took a turn. According to Suge's own words years later, a car from their own security team pulled ahead, forcing him to switch lanes. That's when a white Cadillac pulled up on the passenger side. Without warning, gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the BMW. Pac was hit. Suge caught a grazing round to the head. Heron's name doesn't show up in the official police report as a shooter or a driver that night, but people close to the row say he was in the middle of the convoy, part of the muscle meant to protect Pac. When the shots went off, there was chaos. Cars swerving, people trying to return fire, others jumping out to see what happened. Suge later said some of his guys couldn't shoot immediately without risking hitting him and Pac because of how the cars were positioned. When the Cadillac sped off, some of the crew wanted to chase it down, but Suge ordered them to take Pac to the hospital instead. That decision meant Heron's focus, like everyone else's, turned from retaliation to survival. They headed to University Medical Center, with police stopping them along the way, searching, questioning, wasting time while Pac was bleeding in the car. Suge later told the story of Pac joking with cops and medics, making fun of them for not knowing how to work the BMW's seatbelt. "If I was in a Honda, you'd have had me out already." Pac laughed. Heron, like the rest of the crew, knew that even in pain, Pac had that kind of energy, half serious, half defiant. But underneath the laughs, there was tension. Everyone knew this wasn't just a random drive-by. This was payback for the MGM, and in the streets' eyes, it was fair game. Pac hung on for 6 days before dying on September 13th, 1996. Heron took the loss personally. Pac wasn't just another artist at death row, he was a brother. They had built trust fast. Bonded by a mix of respect and survival, Heron had protected him more than once from Crip confrontations, and now, in the end, it was gang politics that took him out. The days after Pac's death turned Compton into a war zone. According to police reports, shootings broke out between the Southside Crips and Mob Piru almost immediately. On September 9th, Southside Crip leader Darnell Brim was shot in the back. The same day, a 10-year-old bystander was hit and left in critical condition. Later that day, a drive-by targeted Looters Park Piru's Mob Piru allies. Shots were fired, shell casings left behind, and tensions climbed even higher. Heron's crew knew exactly where the shots were coming from. Informants were telling police that Keefe D's nephew, the same Orlando Anderson who got jumped at the MGM, was the shooter who took Pac's life. The Southside Crips were now rolling with other Crip sets, Neighborhood Crips, Kelly Park Crips, and Atlantic Drive Crips, against Mob Piru, Looters Park Piru, and Elm Lane Piru. The alliances had shifted overnight. Heron was right in the middle of that map. He was Mob Piru, death row muscle, and one of the men who had been in the room and the fight before Pac's murder. He knew the game wasn't over just because the Vegas shooting was done. If anything, it had just started. The streets were calling for blood, and everyone knew where the lines were drawn. But here's the thing about Heron. He wasn't reckless. Yes, he had the Mr. 17 reputation, but he wasn't about making noise just to be seen. People who knew him said he was patient, calculated. If he was going to make a move, it was going to be smart. And after Pac's murder, patience might have been the only thing keeping him alive in a city ready to erupt. The cops knew retaliation was coming. They were watching the Pirus, they were watching the Southside Crips, and they were watching death row. Every shooting, every car stop, every name that came up in informant tips was tied back to that night in Vegas. Heron's name floated in those circles too, not as a suspect in Pac's death, but as one of the key players in the lead-up. Still, inside the row, the loss of Pac hit differently. For Heron, it wasn't just losing a friend, it was losing a piece of what made the row feel untouchable. Pac brought energy, attention, and danger. Without him, things felt unstable. The beefs didn't slow down, but the unity that Pac inspired was gone. Heron's loyalty didn't die with Pac though. If anything, it got sharper. The people who were left, Suge, Buntry, Neckbone, those were still his people, but the writing was on the wall. Death row's days as an empire were numbered, and the streets that had always been their foundation were now pulling them apart. And in that post-Pac death row, the danger wasn't just coming from enemies on the outside. Sometimes it was sitting right next to you at the table. For a man like Heron, who had built a life on loyalty, that was the kind of betrayal that could be even deadlier than a bullet. In the weeks after Vegas, the tension wasn't just in the streets. It was in every meeting, every studio session, every late-night phone call. Heron could feel it. The conversations were shorter, the stares lasted longer, and the air inside death row's offices was heavy. People were picking sides without saying it out loud. Every handshake came with a silent question. Is this still my homie, or is he lining me up? For a man like Heron, who thrived on reading people, the shift was impossible to miss. Every time a car slowed near the curb, every time a stranger lingered too long, it put everyone on edge. Heron had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't one beef with one crew. This was a chain reaction. One wrong step, one wrong word, and the heat could land on anyone connected to that night in Vegas. For someone living the life Heron lived, it meant staying ready every second, because in Compton, you never knew when the next shot was coming. And eventually, that heat caught up with Heron. The streets were watching, and when the time came, they didn't miss. June 1st, 1997. The sun was slipping low over Compton, painting the streets in that golden light that comes right before dark. Aaron Heron Palmer had just left a Death Row Records party at Gonzalez Park. The park was alive that day. Music, cars, familiar faces, the kind of scene where the streets and the label blended into one. But for Heron, the party was over. It was time to head home. He was behind the wheel, making his way through the city he'd known his whole life. These were streets he could drive with his eyes closed, places where he had history on every corner. But even in familiar territory, the rules didn't change. If you were Mob Piru, if you were Death Row Muscle, you never really let your guard down. Not fully. Heron rolled up to a red light just before sunset. The moment hung there, quiet, ordinary. Then a blue van pulled up behind him. In Compton, that's the kind of detail your mind notices without thinking. The wrong car, the wrong color, the wrong time of day. It all meant something. Before the light could change, the van's doors flew open. Two men jumped out. No words, no hesitation. The sound of gunfire split the air. Shot after shot ripped through the evening. It was fast, ruthless, and planned. When the shooters were done, they jumped back in the van and sped off, leaving Heron slumped over in his car. He was gone before help could even get there. 30 years old, Mr. 17. The man who had been feared and respected in equal measure. The man who had stood in Pac's corner, who had handled problems for Death Row that never made headlines. For the Compton Police Department, this was more than just another shooting. Bobby Ladd, one of the officers who knew the streets well, summed it up. When Heron went down, we were all like, whoa, what's going on here? Until that moment, nobody ever had the nerve to take out anyone in Chugga's inner circle. This was no ordinary murder. Someone was sending a message. That's what made it hit so hard. Heron wasn't some easy target. He wasn't caught up in petty street drama. If you came for him, you were either ready to go all the way or you had people behind you who were. His murder told everyone watching that even the tightest circles could be broken into. On the streets, talk spread fast. When the news hit the Mob Piru, it wasn't just grief, it was shock. This was a man who had survived the worst Compton had to offer for decades. Someone who had outlived wars between gangs, survived the chaos of Death Row in its prime, and walked away from situations most men didn't. In the days after, people replayed his last moments in their minds, the kind of hit that said the shooters knew exactly where he'd be, exactly when to move, and exactly how to disappear after. His death sent ripples through the streets and through Death Row's already crumbling foundation. Without him, the label lost one of the few people who could speak to both the streets and the artists without losing credibility on either side. Years later, when the smoke had cleared and Death Row was no longer the powerhouse it had been, people still remembered him. For some, it was the loss of a friend who had stood beside them through the worst. For others, it was just another casualty in a world where life was cheap and loyalty could turn into a death sentence overnight. They talked about his loyalty to Pac, to Suge, to the mob. Heron's murder didn't just take a man's life, it sent a signal, and everyone who mattered in that world heard it loud and clear. Years later, Heron's own son, Christopher, was shot and killed in a gang-related incident at just 17 years old. The number made people wonder if it was a cruel twist of fate or something darker. But Heron's story didn't just live in gang files or whispered street tales. It lived in the memories of the people who worked beside him, people who saw the real chaos behind the fame, and one of those people was Tommy D. Tommy D. Daugherty wasn't from Compton. He wasn't from the streets. He was a house engineer, one of the best in the business, working with legends like Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Tupac Shakur. Before Death Row, he had done sessions with Prince and George Clinton, but when he walked into the Death Row world, he stepped straight into the heart of gangsta rap's most dangerous era. And in that place, survival wasn't just about knowing your job, it was about knowing who had your back. Tommy said it himself. At Death Row, you went to work and had no idea what was going to happen. The less you knew, the better. That wasn't an exaggeration. The label was a mix of platinum records, gang politics, and street payback. You could be recording a hit song one minute and watching fists, or worse, fly the next. Heron Palmer, the man everyone in the building knew as Mr. 17, was the head of Death Row Security. But security in this world didn't just mean checking IDs at the door. Heron was murder for hire, a man feared on the streets long before Death Row made him part of Suge Knight's inner circle. If Heron was around, you knew serious business was being handled. Tommy remembered the day he realized he'd earned Heron's respect. Heron came up to him and said, "You got got to come outside and check out my car, Tommy." Tommy followed him out and saw a Jeep Cherokee parked there, bullet holes running all down the side. Before Tommy could even react, Heron grinned and said, "You should see what their car looks like." It wasn't just a war story, it was a warning about the world they were in. Then Heron hit him with something that stuck. "Tommy D, I've got to tell you something, man. I don't know what it is about you, man, but some of the hardest motherfuckers, and motherfuckers who don't even like motherfuckers, them fuckers like you." And Suge said, "Make sure nobody fucks with him, so you don't have to worry about shit. If anybody fucks with you, you come and talk to Heron." For Tommy, that was more than just a compliment. In Death Row's world, having Heron say you were under his protection was like having armor. It meant you could do your work without looking over your shoulder every second. Not many people got that kind of pass, but Heron's approval didn't erase the danger. Tommy admitted it. "Heron's dead now, but you know what's crazy? I knew he was going to get killed, and he knew he was going to get killed. In that world, nobody thought they were untouchable. Everyone understood the risk. They accepted the fact that they could get blasted at any minute," Tommy said. Death Row at that time was a place where bodies were dropping constantly. Tommy put it bluntly. There were like 2 people a week that got killed at Death Row. It wasn't just hype. The streets around the label were tied to real gang wars, and the music industry's success didn't protect anyone from the rules of that life. Heron knew those rules better than anyone. He played his part without flinching, taking on jobs most men wouldn't survive, and he carried himself with the kind of presence that told people not to test him. But even with all his power and all his fearlessness, he was still in the same game as everyone else at Death Row. And in that game, nobody lasted forever. Heron Palmer's story is one of those that still hangs heavy in the air, even decades later. People respected him because he lived by his code. Loyalty first, no matter the cost. Heron was always close to the action, not because he was chasing fame, but because he was trusted to be there when it mattered. In a world where everybody claimed to be real, Heron was the one who didn't need to claim it. His name carried that weight for him. In the years since his death, the streets have tried to piece together the why and the who. People whispered about who could have pulled it off. Theories bounced between personal beef, money owed, and power plays inside Death Row. For years, the truth stayed in the shadows. But Heron's name still comes up when people talk about the Death Row days, when Pac's last moments are remembered, when Mob Piru's history gets brought up. He's part of that era's DNA. So, after everything we've seen in this story, from loyalty and brotherhood to betrayal and bullets, here's the real question. In a game where the streets never forget, was Heron's death the end of his story, or just the start of another one? Let us know what you think in the comments box below. And if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more.